He left me to pay a $4,000 bill on my own birthday. 17 of his wealthy clients watched as my husband called me a disgrace and walked out of the restaurant, leaving me standing there in my red dress like a fool. They laughed, they all laughed until the subpoenas came. That night, I didn't cry. I calculated. And 3 months later, federal agents raided his firm while I sipped coffee in my classroom, teaching 8-year-olds about justice. My name is Savannah Aldridge, and I used to believe in fairy tales, not the Disney kind I teach 3rd grade. I know better, but the grown-up version where hard work and loyalty eventually pay off, where love conquers all, where your husband's success becomes your success. I believed all of that until the night Charles left me standing in Le Baradin with a $4,000 check and 17 witnesses to my humiliation. The evening had started with such promise. I'd worn the red dress he bought me last Christmas, the one that made me feel like I belonged in his world of hedge funds and Harvard MBAs. My grandmother's ruby lipstick, the only expensive thing she'd ever owned, completed the look in the mirror. I'd almost convinced myself I could be one of them. Remember, Charles had said in the Uber, not looking up from his phone. Let me do the talking during the portfolio discussion. These aren't your teacher friends. They expect a certain level of sophistication. I nodded, already shrinking into myself. It was my 34th birthday, but this dinner wasn't about me. Nothing ever was anymore. The private dining room at Leonardin gleamed with the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted. 17 of Charles's most important clients and their spouses were already seated when we arrived. I recognized most of them, the Weatherbys with their matching Rolexes, the Changs who owned half of Tribeca, the Martinellis, whose daughter went to Dalton. They looked up briefly when we entered, their smiles as precisely calibrated as their investment portfolios. Charles and Sarah. Isn't it, Mrs. Aldridge? Mrs. Weatherby's voice dripped condescension. Savannah, I corrected gently, taking my assigned seat at the far end of the table. Of course, the teacher. She said it the way you'd say, the help. The first 2 courses passed in a blur of market predictions and humble brags about vacation homes. I smiled when expected, laughed at jokes I didn't understand, and kept my opinions about public school funding to myself. Charles held court at the center of the table, his voice growing louder with each glass of Montrachet. Then came the toast. Gentlemen, ladies, Charles stood, raising his glass. Before we discuss the Q3 projections, I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. I know some of you had concerns about the Henderson account, but I assure you. He launched into a speech about fiduciary responsibility and market volatility. I watched him, waiting for any acknowledgement that this was also my birthday dinner. Nothing came. 20 minutes in, Mr. Chung interrupted. Charles, Mr. Chung interrupted. This is all well and good, but what about the rumors the sec's been sniffing around? We need assurances that our investments are secure. Charles's face flushed. I can assure you that everything is above board, unlike some people at this table. I understand the value of discretion and professionalism. His eyes flicked to me. Not everyone can grasp the complexities of what we do. Take my wife, for instance. The room fell silent. My hand tightened around my water glass. Here's a woman who thinks teaching finger painting to 8-year-olds is a career, who thinks a master's degree in education makes her an intellectual, who sits at this table in a dress I bought her, eating food she could never afford, and still has the audacity to judge the very system that feeds her. Charles, please, I whispered. He laughed, ugly and sharp. You want to know what's disgraceful? Having to explain to my partners why my wife drives a Honda, why she shops at Target, why she insists on working a job that pays less than what I spend on wine at these dinners. The other diners shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Mrs. Weatherby actually smirked. You're an embarrassment, Charles continued, his voice rising. A constant reminder of where I came from. Middle-class mediocrity clinging to my success like a parasite. You think your little teaching job gives you purpose. You're a placeholder, a tax write-off, a disgrace. He threw his napkin on the table. I'm done pretending otherwise. You want to play house with your construction paper and glue sticks. Fine, but you'll do it without me. He turned to the table. My apologies for the disruption. I'll be at the bar when you're ready to discuss real business. Then, to me, loud enough for everyone to hear, the check's on you tonight. Consider it your birthday present. A lesson in paying your own way for once. And he left. 17 pairs of eyes turned to me, some pitying, some amused, all waiting to see what the teacher would do next. The waiter approached hesitantly with the leather check folder, $4,127.83 for a dinner I'd barely touched, 4 people who saw me as entertainment. I opened my purse, the designer bag Charles had insisted I carry, and pulled out a credit card he didn't know I had. One I'd opened 6 months ago, when I'd started noticing things, little things, inconsistencies, lies. Will that be all? Madam, the waiter asked kindly. Yes, thank you. My voice didn't shake. My hands didn't tremble as I signed the receipt. I stood, smoothed my red dress, and looked at each person at the table. Thank you all for coming to my birthday dinner. I hope the food was worth the show. Mrs. Weatherby had the decency to look away. Mr. Chung cleared his throat. The Martinellis suddenly found their phones fascinating. I walked out of La Bernardine with my head high, past the bar where Charles held court, with a fresh audience, out into the Manhattan night, where the November air bit through my dress like teeth. But I didn't cry, didn't rage, didn't call my sister, or my mother, or any of the friends Charles had systematically alienated me from over the years. Instead, I stood on that sidewalk, watching taxis stream past in rivers of yellow light, and felt something shift inside me, not breaking, but building. All those little moments of humiliation, all those subtle cruelties, all those times I'd smiled and swallowed my pride because love was supposed to be about compromise. I pulled out my phone and opened the hidden folder I'd labeled recipes, screenshots, bank statements, text messages. 6 months of evidence I'd gathered while pretending to be the grateful fool he thought I was. He was right about one thing. I had been a placeholder, but not for the reasons he thought. I'd been holding a place for the woman I was about to become. That morning had begun, like so many others, with me trying to convince myself that this time would be different. I'd woken at 5:30, careful not to disturb Charles as I slipped out of bed. In the bathroom mirror, I looked at myself, really looked. 34 years old. Laugh lines starting to show, dark circles from grading papers until midnight. When had I started looking so tired? But today was my birthday. My birthday. And Charles had actually remembered, suggesting dinner at La Bernardine weeks ago. Invite whoever you want, he'd said, though we both knew he meant his clients. Still, it was something, a gesture, a sign that maybe I still mattered. I'd spent an hour getting ready, using the expensive face cream from the Madison Avenue spa Charles's secretary had booked for me last Christmas. My hands shook slightly as I applied my grandmother's lipstick, Russian red, a color she'd worn every Sunday to church until the day she died. Never let them see you without your lipstick, Savannah. It's armor for the soul. She used to say that. The red dress hung in the closet like a promise. Charles had chosen it himself at Bergdorf's, dismissing my protests about the price. My wife needs to look the part, he'd said. And I'd convinced myself it was romance rather than image management. I'd laid out everything the night before, the dress, the Louis Vuitton heels that still gave me blisters, the Harry Winston earrings that were on loan from Charles's company for client events. Costume pieces for a role I'd been playing for 7 years. "You're up early," Charles emerged from the bedroom, already scrolling through his phone. "Tokyo markets are brutal. The Nikkei is down 3%. "It's my birthday," I said softly. He glanced up briefly. "Right. The dinner. Listen, I need you to understand something about tonight. The Henderson situation has everyone on edge. These people need reassurance. Not." He gestured vaguely at me. "Not teacher talk. No stories about your classroom. No opinions about wealth inequality. Just smile and let me handle the conversation." Of course, the words came automatically now, "and wear the Cartier necklace, not your grandmother's pearls. We are not in Ohio anymore, Savannah." I'd nodded, already reaching for the jewelry box where I kept the pearls. Anyway, after he left for the office, I'd put them on, running my fingers over their imperfect surfaces, real pearls, earned by a woman who'd raised 4 children on a secretary's salary. I wore them under my cardigan all day, a secret rebellion. At PS 158, my third graders had been waiting with handmade cards spread across my desk. "Happy birthday, Mrs. A." They chorused as I walked in. Michaela had drawn me as a superhero. James had written a poem about how I made math fun. Aisha, whose parents were going through a divorce, had simply written, "You make me feel safe." I'd almost cried then, surrounded by construction paper, and glitter glue, and the kind of pure affection money couldn't buy. These children saw me, really saw me. To them, I wasn't a placeholder, or an embarrassment. I was the person who taught them to read, who hugged them when they fell on the playground, who kept graham crackers in my drawer for the ones who came to school hungry. "Mrs. A, are you having a party?" Michaela asked. "Something like that," I'd replied, already dreading it. During lunch, I'd sat in the teacher's lounge with my colleague, Maria, who'd brought me a cupcake from the bodega. "Any special plans?" "Charles is taking me to La Bernardine with some clients." Maria had given me a look I'd grown used to, part pity, part frustration. "On your birthday, girl, when are you going to stop letting that man treat you like an accessory?" I'd changed the subject, but her words haunted me through the afternoon. When was I going to stop? When had I even started? I could pinpoint it exactly the moment Charles had proposed 7 years ago. We'd been so different then. He was fresh out of Wharton, ambitious, but still human. I was teaching in the Bronx, convinced I could change the world one child at a time. He'd said he loved my passion, my dedication to something bigger than money. Now he called it naive, embarrassing, provincial. After school, I'd stopped at D'Agostino's to buy pantyhose. Charles insisted on pantyhose, even though no one under 50 wore them anymore. The fluorescent lights made me look sallow, older. When had I started dressing like his mother's friends? When had I stopped being Savannah and become Mrs. Charles Aldridge, the teacher wife, who knew her place? Back home, I'd found Charles's assistant had sent a text, "Mr. Aldridge wants to remind you that dinner is at 8 p.m. sharp. Business casual, elegant. He suggests the red dress. Business casual, elegant, for my birthday dinner." I'd poured myself a glass of wine, the good stuff, sincerely, Charles kept for special occasions, and sat on our balcony overlooking Central Park. 34 years old. No children because Charles said we weren't ready. No close friends because Charles found them limiting. No career advancement, because Charles needed me available for client dinners and charity galas. When had my life become so small? The wine made me honest with myself. I'd been noticing things lately. Receipts for restaurants I'd never been to. Charges for jewelry I'd never received. Late nights at the office that didn't align with Tokyo market hours. The way he'd stopped touching me except when we were in public. His hand on my back, a performance rather than affection. 6 months ago, I'd started documenting everything, just in case. My grandmother had taught me that, too. Hope for the best, baby, but keep your receipts. As I dressed for dinner, applying makeup to hide the tiredness, zipping myself into the red dress that cost more than I made in a month, I'd allowed myself one moment of hope. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe Charles would remember who we used to be. Maybe he'd toast to me, to us, to something more than quarterly projections and portfolio performance. I'd even practiced my smile in the mirror, the one that said I was grateful, content, uncomplicated, the smile of a woman who knew her place. By the time Charles came home to change, I was ready. Armor in place, lipstick perfect, hair smoothed, opinion silenced. He'd looked at me appraisingly, the way he examined spreadsheets. "You'll do," he'd said. "Remember, let me handle the conversation. These people don't want to hear about your little school stories." My little school stories, my little life, my little dreams. As we'd headed to the restaurant, I touched my grandmother's pearls one last time, hidden beneath the dress. I'd thought about her strength, her dignity, her refusal to be diminished by anyone. I should have known then that this night would change everything. Should have recognized the weight in the air, the sense of something ending or beginning. But I'd simply smiled, played my part, and walked into that restaurant believing I was still the woman who needed Charles's world to feel whole. 3 hours later, standing on that sidewalk with a $4,000 receipt in my hand, I finally understood what my grandmother's pearls had been trying to tell me all along. Real worth doesn't need anyone else's validation, and some women aren't meant to be placeholders. They are meant to be a reckoning. The country club incident should have been my first warning. 3 months before my birthday disaster, Charles had insisted I attend the Greenwich Yacht Club's annual charity luncheon. Wear the Chanel suit, he'd instructed. And please, Savannah, try to fit in. I'd stood in the marble foyer, feeling like a fraud in my borrowed elegance, while women who lunched for a living air-kissed around me. Their conversation was a foreign language of Hampton's houses and private school waiting lists, punctuated by the delicate clink of Cartier against China. "Oh, you're Charles's wife," Muffy Weatherby had exclaimed, looking me up and down like I was a clearance rack find. "He's told us so much about you, a teacher." How quaint. I'd been seated between 2 women who spoke over me for the entire first course, discussing their children's equestrian lessons. When I tried to contribute, mentioning that one of my students had just won a citywide writing contest, they'd looked at me with polite confusion, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly started speaking. Then came the wine incident. I still believe it was deliberate. Patricia Martinelli, reaching across me for the butter, her elbow catching my glass with surgical precision. The Pinot Noir had bloomed across my cream suit like a wound, spreading dark and damming across the fabric. "Oh dear," Patricia's voice dripped false concern. "How clumsy of me. That's going to stain. You know, Chanel is so unforgiving." The table had fallen silent. 20 pairs of eyes watching as I sat there, wine dripping onto the monogrammed napkins, waiting to see if the teacher would cry, would make a scene, would confirm their assumptions about where Charles had found me. "Accidents happen," I'd said quietly, dabbing at the stain with as much dignity as I could muster. "Indeed, they do," Muffy had murmured. "Though some of us seem more accident-prone than others." The laughter that followed was refined, subtle, the kind that sliced without leaving visible wounds. I'd excused myself to the bathroom, where I'd stood in a stall trying not to cry, while listening to 2 women discuss whether Charles had married me for tax purposes or charity. When I'd returned to the table, attempting to cover the stain with my napkin, Charles was deep in conversation about hedge fund regulations. He'd glanced at me once, his eyes flicking to the wine stain with obvious irritation, then turned away. No concern, no defense, no acknowledgement that his wife had just been humiliated. That night, when I tried to tell him about it, he'd sighed with theatrical exhaustion. "You're being too sensitive, Savannah. Patricia Martinella manages a portfolio worth more than your school's entire budget. You think she has time to orchestrate wine spills?" "She called me accident-prone," I said. They all laughed. Maybe if you tried harder to fit in, they wouldn't have to laugh. He'd scrolled through his phone, already dismissing me. "I can't keep making excuses for you. These women volunteer for the Met. They run foundations. They understand our world. You talk about finger painting and parent-teacher conferences." I'd stood there in our bedroom, still smelling faintly of wine, and realized he was ashamed of me, not just frustrated or embarrassed, genuinely ashamed of the woman he'd chosen to marry. The pattern had started long before that, though, little erosions of dignity I'd explained away as compromise. The dinner party, where he'd interrupted my story about a breakthrough with a struggling student to tell everyone I got too emotionally invested. The client meeting where he'd introduced me as his wife, who keeps herself busy with teaching. The charity gala where he'd actually told me to stand there and look pretty while he worked. I'd become a prop in the carefully curated story of Charles Aldridge, rising financial star. The teacher wife humanized him, made him seem grounded, but only in small doses. Only when I knew my place, only when I didn't remind anyone that he'd once been Charles from Columbus, whose father sold insurance, and whose mother worked double shifts at the hospital. The investment in my erasure had been gradual, but systematic. First, he'd suggested I quit teaching to support his career. When I'd refused, he'd started scheduling important dinners during parent-teacher conferences. He'd bought me clothes that transformed me into a Greenwich wife costume, donated my comfortable teaching wardrobe to charity without asking. He'd filled our social calendar with his colleagues and clients until I realized one day that I hadn't seen my own friends in months. "Your teacher friends make me uncomfortable," he'd explained. "All they talk about is politics and social justice. It's exhausting." What he meant was, they see through me. They remember when you were vibrant and independent. They ask why you look so tired, so quiet, so unlike yourself. Even my family had noticed the change. Last Christmas, my sister pulled me aside in my mother's kitchen. "You're disappearing, Sav," she'd said. "Every time I see you, there's less of you there." I'd made excuses. Of course, Charles is under pressure. The markets were volatile. Once he makes partner, things will calm down. We'll have children. I'll have more time for myself. The lies we tell ourselves to avoid admitting we've built our life on quicksand. But the country club incident had cracked something open. In the weeks that followed, I'd started seeing our marriage clearly. How he monitored my spending, but had secret credit cards. How he criticized my appearance, but flirted openly with cocktail waitresses. "You used to be different," I told him one night after another dinner where I'd been relegated to the wives' corner, listening to discussions about Botox and boarding schools. "I grew up," he'd replied coldly. "Maybe you should try it." The man who'd once written me poetry on napkins at diners had become someone who vetted my conversation topics before parties. The man who'd said he loved my passion for teaching now called it playing school. The man who'd promised we were partners now treated me like an employee, one he was constantly on the verge of firing. 3 weeks before my birthday, at another insufferable dinner, I'd overheard him talking to James Weatherby. They didn't know I was returning from the bathroom. Didn't see me pause in the shadow of the partition. "The prenup is ironclad," Charles was saying. "Thank God my lawyer insisted." Can you imagine? She probably thinks she's entitled to half of everything. "Smart man," James had replied. "Though I still don't understand why you married her in the first place. There must have been more suitable options." She served her purpose, Charles had said, and the casual cruelty of it had knocked the breath out of me. Made me look stable, grounded. You know how clients like that family man image. But between us, I'm already exploring exit strategies. Just need to position it right. I'd stood there frozen as the man I'd loved reduced our marriage to a business transaction. Our life together to a strategic move on his climb up the corporate ladder. Served her purpose, like I was a rental car, or a temporary apartment. That night I'd created the hidden folder on my phone, started screenshots, started paying attention to the details I'd been trained to ignore. The receipts from Tiffany's for jewelry I'd never seen. The hotel charges in the city when he was supposedly at conferences. The text messages that came late at night, making him smile in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in years. I'd also started reconnecting with who I used to be, staying late at school to tutor struggling students, having coffee with Maria and my other teacher friends, wearing my grandmother's pearls under my designer clothes, a small rebellion that reminded me of the woman I'd been before Charles decided she wasn't enough. By the night of my birthday dinner, I'd accumulated 6 months of evidence and a growing certainty that I wasn't losing my mind. I was finding it. Every humiliation, every dismissal, every moment of being treated like an inconvenient accessory had been building to something. I just hadn't known it would explode in such spectacular fashion. With 17 witnesses and a $4,000 price tag, standing on that sidewalk after Charles's public evisceration, I'd felt the full weight of every compromise, every silenced opinion, every time I'd smiled when I wanted to scream, the wine stain at the country club, the overheard conversation about exit strategies, the systematic erasure of everything that made me who I was. He was right about one thing. I had been a disgrace. A disgrace to the woman my grandmother raised. A disgrace to the teacher my students adored. A disgrace to the person I'd been before I'd agreed to disappear into the shadow of Charles Aldridge's ambitions. But disgrace, I was learning, could be a powerful motivator, and shadows have a way of growing teeth. The receipt that changed everything was crumpled in the pocket of his Tom Ford suit, the one I'd taken to the dry cleaners the morning after my birthday humiliation. I almost missed it. My hands were shaking as I emptied the pockets, still raw from the previous night's events. But there it was. Le Bernardin, $4,278.30. 2 dinners. Champagne dated 3 weeks ago, when Charles had supposedly been at a client dinner in Boston. I smoothed it out on our marble kitchen counter, staring at the details. Table 12. The romantic corner booth I'd once suggested for our anniversary, only to be told it was too intimate for a professional setting. The champagne, Perrier Jouet Grand Brut, the same one he'd ordered the night he proposed. Something cold and calculating replaced the hurt in my chest. I photographed the receipt, added it to my hidden folder, then began a systematic search of his study. Charles had always been meticulous about his privacy. His home office was a fortress of locked drawers and password-protected files. But he'd also been arrogant, convinced I was too simple to pay attention, too grateful to question. He didn't know that teachers are investigators by nature. We notice everything, from forged parent signatures to signs of trouble at home. The lipstick on his collar from last month, Chanel Rouge Allure in Seduisant, a shade I'd never worn. I'd noted it, photographed it, filed it away. The second phone I'd found in his gym bag, explained away as a work phone, though it only ever rang late at night. The mysterious charges on our joint credit card, quickly reversed, but not before I'd screenshot them. In his desk drawer, beneath tax documents, I found the prenup I'd signed 7 years ago. I'd been so in love then, so trusting when he'd presented it as just a formality. Now I read it with the clarity of someone who'd been publicly discarded like restaurant waste. The document was harsh. I'd get nothing in a standard divorce, just my teacher salary and whatever I'd brought into the marriage. But there, on page 47, in the subsection, Charles had rushed me past was the clause that made my hands steady for the first time in days. Section 12.3, Moral turpitude. In the event that either party engages in behavior constituting moral turpitude, including, but not limited to adultery, financial malfeasance, or acts resulting in public disgrace, or criminal conviction, all protections afforded to said party under this agreement shall be null and void. Moral turpitude, such an antiquated phrase, probably inserted by some old-school lawyer. Charles had likely skimmed right past it, confident it would never apply to him. After all, I was the small-town girl who should be grateful. He was the financial genius above reproach. I photographed every page, then returned the document exactly as I'd found it. Then I went deeper. His laptop was password protected, but Charles wasn't as clever as he thought. The password was still his Columbia student ID. He used it for everything. The password was still his Columbia student ID. He used it for everything. Convinced that consistency was security, I was in within minutes. His email told stories within stories. The mysterious receipts matched dates with messages from someone named Victoria Chen. Not a client, as he'd claimed, but a junior analyst at his firm. The email started professionally, but had evolved into something else entirely. Can't wait to see you tonight. Same place. V. Last night was incredible. When are you going to tell her? V. The Cartier bracelet is beautiful. You spoil me. V. The Cartier bracelet. I'd seen the charge, $32,000, explained as a client gift. I screenshot everything. My teacher's instincts for documentation serving me well. Create a paper trail. Evidence is everything. But the adultery was just the beginning. As I dug deeper into his files, I found folders within folders, encrypted but poorly. Charles's arrogance extending even to his security measures, financial documents that made no sense, even to someone who'd learned to read markets, just to have something to discuss at his interminable dinners. Client accounts with discrepancies, small amounts, $10,000 here, $25,000 there. There, moved through shell companies and offshore accounts, always from elderly clients, the ones who trusted Charles implicitly, who probably never scrutinized their statements. The amounts were calculated to fly under the radar, but the pattern was clear when you looked at them together. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, 82, widowed, had authorized transfers totaling $275,000 over 2 years. Mr. George Patterson, 79, with early-stage dementia, had agreed to invest in companies that existed only on paper. The evidence was all there, hidden in plain sight by a man who believed his wife was too stupid to understand financial crime. I worked through the night, fueled by rage and clarity. Every document photographed, every email forwarded to my private account, every piece of evidence backed up to cloud storage existed. By dawn, I had a comprehensive file that would make any prosecutor weep with joy. The prenup called it moral turpitude. The FBI would call it elder abuse, wire fraud, and embezzlement, but I called it karma. As the sun rose over Central Park, I sat in my grandmother's rocking chair, the only piece of furniture I'd insisted on keeping when Charles redecorated, and opened a new folder on my phone. This one I didn't hide. I labeled it simply, Holiday Recipes. Inside, I organized everything methodically. Financial crimes, documented transfers, fraudulent accounts, embezzlement evidence. Adultery, emails, receipts, photographs, credit card records. Asset hiding, offshore accounts, shell companies, unreported income. Client testimonials. Recordings of conversations where Charles admitted to defrauding elderly clients. The final piece came from an unexpected source. Our doorman, Henry, who'd always been kind to me, had pulled me aside that morning. Mrs. Aldridge, he'd said, I hope you don't mind me saying, but you deserve better than how he treats you. He'd handed me a flash drive. Security footage from the building, times he came home with guests. Thought you should know. The footage showed Charles entering our building with Victoria Chen on multiple occasions when I was at school. The timestamps matched his supposed client dinners, his late nights at the office, his weekend golf games. By 7 a.m., when Charles emerged from the bedroom looking for his coffee, I was sitting at the kitchen counter, my grandmother's pearls around my neck, reading my students' birthday cards from 2 days ago. You look tired, he said, not really looking at me. Did you sleep on the couch, still pouting about dinner? I smiled, the same smile I'd perfected for his colleagues. Just doing some meal planning. You know me, always organizing. He grunted, grabbed his coffee, and headed for the shower. As the water ran, his personal phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Victoria. Missing you already. When will you be free? I deleted the message, then typed a reply. Can't talk now. Wife is getting suspicious. Need to be more careful. The response was immediate. I thought you were handling that. You promised after bonus season. I deleted that, too. Then, I placed his phone exactly where he'd left it. When Charles left for work, kissing my cheek in the same perfunctory way he signed checks, I opened my holiday recipes folder one more time. Everything was there. 7 years of marriage reduced to gigabytes of evidence. He thought he'd married a simple teacher from Ohio who'd be grateful for his attention, who'd look the other way, who'd smile and pay the bills while he built his empire on lies and stolen money. He was half right. I was a teacher, and class was about to be in session. The teaching conference was mandatory professional development, the kind Charles usually mocked. Another day of construction paper strategies. He'd sneered when I told him about it, but that conference in the Javits Center would prove to be the best education of my life. I was sitting alone during lunch break, reviewing my evidence folder for the 100th time, when she sat down across from me. Rachel Preston was the kind of woman who commanded attention without trying, sharp eyes behind designer glasses, silver hair cut in a precise bob, wearing a suit that whispered power rather than shouted it. Divorce, she asked without preamble, nodding at my phone screen. I fumbled to close the folder. I'm sorry. Financial documents, timestamp evidence, that particular look of controlled fury. I've seen it 1,000 times. She extended a hand. Rachel Preston. I teach forensic accounting at John Jay. Used to specialize in high net worth divorces before I discovered teaching paid better for the soul. Something about her directness broke through my careful facade. Savannah Aldridge, 3rd grade. And maybe divorce. I don't know yet. May I? She gestured at my phone. Against every instinct, I found myself showing her a few screenshots. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened with each swipe. Your husband is Charles Aldridge at Meridian Capital. I nodded, surprised she knew of him. Interesting. She pulled out her business card, but it wasn't for the college. Preston Forensic Consulting. I still take select cases. Your husband's firm has been on several watch lists. Nothing proven, but... She tapped my phone screen. This changes things. I don't understand. Rachel leaned forward. What you have here isn't just evidence of adultery, Mrs. Aldridge. These financial patterns, I've seen them before. Elder targeting, systematic theft disguised as portfolio management. Your husband isn't just cheating on you, he's stealing from vulnerable clients. My coffee went cold as she walked me through what she saw in the documents. Patterns I'd noticed but couldn't name. Techniques designed to exploit trust. Numbers that told stories of betrayal far beyond my marriage. The FBI would be very interested in this, she said quietly. But you need more, and you need to be smart about how you gather it. Why are you helping me? She smiled, the first warmth I'd seen from her. Because 20 years ago, I was you, sitting at a conference, pretending my world wasn't falling apart. Discovering my executive husband was a criminal. But I didn't have help. I figured it out alone. And by the time I did, he'd hidden most of the assets offshore. We spent the rest of lunch mapping out a strategy. Rachel explained what to look for, how to document it, which agencies to contact when ready. She gave me encrypted apps to use, taught me about metadata, showed me how to build an airtight case. Your teacher instincts are good, she noted. You document like someone who understands evidence, but you need to think bigger. This isn't just about your divorce. This is about justice for those clients. Over the following weeks, Rachel became my guide through the labyrinth of financial crime. We met at coffee shops in neighborhoods Charles would never visit, poring over documents like students preparing for the world's worst final exam. She taught me to read between the lines of financial statements, to spot the ghost transactions Charles thought were invisible. Every elderly client he'd stolen from had a pattern, isolated, trusting, often with mild cognitive decline. He'd been their charming advisor, the surrogate son who handled their finances so they didn't have to worry. Mrs. Hartwell, whose investments had funded Charles's boat, Mr. Patterson, whose portfolio restructuring had paid for Victoria's apartment. Dozens of others, small amounts stolen over years, adding up to millions. He's smart, Rachel admitted during one session. Never enough to trigger audits, always with fabricated authorization. But he's also arrogant. That's where they always fail. They think they are untouchable. She introduced me to her network, a private investigator who specialized in financial crimes, and SEC whistleblower who knew exactly what regulators looked for. A prosecutor who'd been trying to build a case against Meridian Capital for years, but lacked the inside evidence. Your husband handed you the keys to his own prison. The prosecutor told me he just doesn't know it yet. Through Rachel, I also met Margaret Lynn, whose ex-husband had been Charles's former business partner. She was elegant, composed, and furious in the quiet way of women who'd learned rage was more effective when controlled. They have a system, Margaret explained over tea at the plaza. They share strategies for hiding assets, recommend lawyers who will bury wives in paperwork, coach each other on gaslighting techniques. My ex actually had a PowerPoint on managing divorce risk. She pulled out a hard drive. I kept everything. Recordings, emails, their little boys' club meetings where they laughed about their wives. Charles is featured prominently. The recording she played made my skin crawl. Charles's voice, whiny and confident, explaining to a room of his peers how to manage the asset risk of marriage. The key is psychological. Make them doubt themselves. Constant small criticisms. Isolate them from support systems. Create financial dependence. By the time you're ready to exit, they are too broken to fight. My wife thinks she needs me to survive. She'll take whatever I offer and be grateful. The laughter that followed was familiar. The same sound from my birthday dinner, from the country club. From every moment they'd found my humiliation entertaining. Rachel squeezed my hand. Still think this is just about divorce. We spent the next month building what Rachel called the package. Everything meticulously organized, cross-referenced, financial crimes with documented evidence, recordings proving conspiracy, witness statements from former employees who'd been fired for asking questions. When you're ready, Rachel said, we send copies to the SEC, FBI, IRS, and State Attorney General simultaneously. Media contacts if you want to go nuclear, but timing is everything. You need to protect yourself first. She helped me open accounts Charles couldn't touch. Move my grandmother's jewelry to a safety deposit box. Secure documents that proved my assets from before the marriage. She taught me to play the long game while playing the fool. Keep being the grateful wife, she advised. Let him think you're defeated. The best revenge is the one they never see coming. The night before my birthday dinner, Rachel had called with a final piece of advice. Whatever happens tomorrow, document everything. These men always reveal themselves eventually. Their arrogance is their weakness. She'd been right. Charles's public humiliation of me, witnessed by 17 people, and recorded by restaurant security, had been the final piece. Moral turpitude indeed. Now, sitting in my classroom after school, surrounded by children's artwork and the smell of chalk, I looked at the package we'd built, 3 boxes of evidence, testimonies from 12 elderly victims, financial trails leading to offshore accounts, recordings that would end careers and marriages. Rachel had texted that morning, grand jury convenes next month. Are you ready? I touched my grandmother's pearls. Thought about Mrs. Hartwell living on Social Security because her retirement fund had been invested in Charles's schemes. Thought about Mr. Patterson, confused and frightened, unable to understand where his money had gone. Thought about every woman at that birthday dinner who'd laughed at my humiliation, whose husbands were likely doing the same thing. The wheels of justice grind slowly, Rachel had warned. But they grind exceedingly fine. I opened my phone, looked at the holiday recipes folder one more time, then opened a new message to Rachel. I'm ready. Let's cook. 3 days before my birthday, Charles announced he'd hired an image consultant. Vivienne comes highly recommended, he said, scrolling through his phone at breakfast. She'll help you prepare for dinner. Make sure you're appropriate. Vivienne Blackwood arrived at our apartment like a force of nature. 6 feet tall in heels, wearing architectural clothing that defied conventional fashion, carrying a leather portfolio that probably cost more than my monthly salary. She looked at me the way a sculptor might examine a particularly challenging piece of marble. So, she said, circling me slowly, you're the teacher. It wasn't a question. She opened her portfolio, revealing photos from Charles's various events, me captured in unforgiving clarity. The wrong shoes at the charity gala, the wrong hairstyle at the partner's dinner, the wrong everything at that cursed country club luncheon. Your husband has specific requirements, Vivienne continued. He wants transformation, not improvement. His words, not mine. She pulled out fabric swatches, color wheels, photos of women who looked like they'd been assembled in boardrooms. He suggested we aim for sophisticated neutrality. What does that even mean? It means invisible but expensive. Her smile was sharp. The kind of woman who enhances a man's image without overshadowing it. Trophy adjacent, shall we say. For 3 hours, I stood like a mannequin while Vivienne transformed me. Hair pulled back severely. Loose hair suggests loose morals in their world. Makeup that erased rather than enhanced. You have too much personality in your features. Posture corrections that made me feel like a Victorian governess. Shoulders back, chin down, presence minimized. Now for the conversation coaching, she announced, producing index cards. Conversation coaching. Your husband provided topics to avoid. She read from her list. Your job, your students, your background, your family, current events, personal opinions, books you've read, movies you've seen, anywhere you've traveled that isn't 5-star, any charitable causes you support. And this is underlined, absolutely no corrections when the men are speaking, even if they are wrong. What's left to talk about? The weather, their achievements, gratitude. She set down the cards. Mrs. Aldridge, may I be frank? I nodded, numb from the systematic erasure of my personality. I've dressed many wives for many dinners. I recognize the signs. She gestured at her portfolio. Page through sometime. See how many of these women are now divorced. Your husband didn't hire me to help you succeed at this dinner. He hired me to document your failure. I don't understand. The impossible standards, the contradictory requirements, the public setting. She closed her portfolio with finality. I've styled 3 women for their humiliation dinners. They all looked perfect. It didn't matter. The decision was already made. She stood to leave, then paused. Wear the red dress. Not because he suggested it, because red photographs. Well, whatever happens, you'll want clear documentation. After she left, I sat in our bedroom staring at the red dress hanging like a verdict in the closet. Vivienne was right. Of course, this wasn't about making me presentable. It was about creating evidence of effort, about being able to say later, I tried everything, even hired someone to fix her. Nothing worked. I thought about Rachel's advice. Let him think you're defeated. So, I played the part. I texted Charles. Vivienne was wonderful. Thank you for arranging this. I'll make you proud at dinner. His response was telling, just don't embarrass me. The next 2 days, I prepared like an actor for the performance of a lifetime. I practiced sitting the way Vivienne had taught me, speaking in the modulated tones she demonstrated, smiling the empty smile that said nothing and promised less in the mirror. I watched myself disappear into the role of Charles's ideal wife, a beautiful void where a person used to be. But underneath the performance, I was busy. I positioned my phone's recording app, tested angles for clarity. I reached out to Henry, would restaurant security footage be available? He assured me it would be. I charged battery packs, cleared storage space, prepared for comprehensive documentation. Margaret Lynn had warned me they always overplay their hand at the end. When they think they've won, they get sloppy, cruel. That's when they reveal everything. The morning of my birthday, I woke to find Charles already gone, a note on his pillow, remember 8 p.m. Sharp. Don't be late. Don't overdress. Don't underdress. Just be appropriate. Impossible standards, contradictory requirements. The setup was so obvious now. I spent the day teaching, finding peace in my students' artwork, their stories, their uninhibited joy. During art class, little Aisha painted a picture of her family, stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. That's you, Mrs. A, she said, pointing to a figure surrounded by hearts. You're part of our family, too. I thought about Charles's world, where human value was calculated in portfolios and connections, where wives were accessories and children were legacy investments. Then I looked at my classroom, walls covered in crayon masterpieces, where every child mattered regardless of their parents' net worth. That afternoon, I prepared for dinner with mechanical precision. The red dress. Yes, Vivienne was right. It would photograph beautifully. My grandmother's lipstick, Russian red, the color of defiance. Hair pulled back as instructed, but with my pearls hidden beneath the neckline, a secret rebellion. Everything exactly as Charles had demanded, which I knew would infuriate him more than any deviation could. I arrived at Le Bernardin at 7:55. 5 minutes early, as instructed. The maître d', Henry, greeted me with unusual warmth. Mrs. Aldridge, happy birthday. Your party is already seated in the private dining room. He leaned closer, speaking softly. The security system covers all angles of that room, just so you know. I squeezed his hand in gratitude, then walked into my execution chamber with my head high. 17 faces turned toward me. Charles's expression was unreadable. Was he disappointed I looked perfect? Had he hoped I'd give him an excuse? Savannah. He didn't stand. Didn't acknowledge it was my birthday. You're late. I glanced at my phone. 8:01, my apologies. A ripple of something, anticipation, went through the room. They knew. They all knew what this dinner was really about. I took my assigned seat at the far end of the table, positioned perfectly to be isolated, ignored, observed. Vivienne had prepared me well for this choreography of humiliation. I sat exactly as taught, spine straight, but not rigid, hands folded, but not clenched, present, but not presumptuous. Before we begin, Charles announced, not to me, but to the table. I should mention that tonight's dinner is Savannah's birthday celebration. The words dripped sarcasm, though I'm sure she'd rather be finger-painting with her students than dining with adults. Polite laughter, knowing looks. The show had begun. I smiled Vivienne's empty smile and stayed silent. My phone recording every word from my carefully positioned purse. The red dress caught the light beautifully. Vivienne had been right about that, too. Whatever happened next, it would be preserved in perfect clarity. The first course arrived. 17 people began conversations over and around me. Just as Vivienne had predicted, I was furniture dressed in designer red, playing my part in Charles's carefully orchestrated finale. What he didn't know was that I'd been taking notes from a master choreographer of my own. Rachel Preston had taught me that the best revenge wasn't emotional. It was evidentiary. Record every detail, she told me. Let their words be the evidence that destroys them. As Charles held court, building toward whatever drama he'd planned, I sat in perfect silence, perfectly dressed, perfectly positioned to capture every moment of my own humiliation. He thought he'd hired Vivienne to prepare me for dinner. He'd actually hired her to prepare me for war. Henry intercepted me at the restaurant's entrance the morning after my birthday disaster. The dining room was empty, sunlight streaming through windows that had witnessed my humiliation 12 hours earlier. Mrs. Aldridge, he said quietly. I've been waiting for you. I'd come to settle any outstanding charges, to ensure Charles couldn't claim I'd stolen from him by using his credit card, but Henry waved away my credit card. Everything was paid in full. That's not why I asked you to come. He glanced around, then led me to a small office behind the coat check. I've worked here 15 years. I've seen every kind of power play, every type of cruelty dressed up as fine dining. But last night, he pulled out a tablet, security footage already queued. The owners require us to record private dining rooms for liability issues. The audio is particularly clear. I watched myself on screen, sitting in that red dress while Charles destroyed me with surgical precision. But seeing it from this angle, I noticed things I'd missed. The way other diners leaned away from him as he spoke. The way Mrs. Weatherby actually flinched when he called me a disgrace. The way several people looked genuinely uncomfortable. Your husband is not popular among the staff, Henry continued. This isn't the first time. He pulled up another file. 6 months ago, he made one of our servers cry. Called her too stupid to remember a simple order. 3 months ago, he accused our sommelier of trying to embarrass him because she correctly identified a flaw in the wine he'd chosen. Why are you showing me this? Because people like him think service workers are invisible furniture. We hear everything, see everything, remember everything. He handed me a USB drive. Last night's footage, plus audio, multiple angles, and Mrs. Aldridge, you're not the only wife he's done this to. What do you mean? Henry pulled up another video, dated 2 years earlier, a different woman, blonde, sitting in the same chair I'd occupied. Charles, younger, but just as cruel, delivering a similar speech about disappointment and disgrace. The woman his previous secretary, I realized, crying as he left her with the check. She came back the next week, Henry said. Apologized to the staff for the scene, left a $1,000 tip. Said she wanted to make sure we didn't suffer for witnessing her worst moment. He paused. She's a partner at a law firm now. She specializes in divorce and financial crimes. Her name is Jennifer Walsh. I knew that name. She'd been quoted in a Financial Times article about embezzlement in wealth management firms. The article Charles had mysteriously thrown away before I could read it. Do you have her contact information? Henry smiled. I thought you might ask. That afternoon, I met Jennifer Walsh at her office. She was everything I wasn't, tall, polished, with the kind of presence that commanded boardrooms. But when she watched the footage Henry had given me, I saw my own pain reflected in her eyes. He hasn't changed the script at all, she said quietly. Same location, same audience type, same devastating monologue. Like he's been rehearsing it. Henry said you'd been his secretary. Executive assistant. I was 25. Impressed by his ambition, flattered by his attention. She poured us both coffee from an elegant silver service. The relationship was inappropriate from the start, but I didn't see it. He isolated me from friends, made me dependent on him for everything. Then, when he was done, he orchestrated that dinner to destroy my professional reputation along with my personal one. But you survived. Better than survived. Her smile was sharp. I recorded everything, not just the dinner, months of his behavior. Used it to negotiate a settlement that funded my law degree. And I've been waiting for someone like you ever since. She opened a file cabinet, pulled out folders organized by year. I've tracked every woman Charles has been involved with. The patterns are consistent. He targets women he sees as beneath him, builds them up just enough to make the fall more devastating, then publicly destroys them when they are no longer useful. How many? 12 that I've documented. You're number 13. She spread the files across her desk. But you're different. You have evidence of actual crimes, not just cruelty. And you have Rachel Preston. You know Rachel. She's the reason I'm a lawyer. Took my case pro bono when I had nothing. Taught me how to turn pain into power. Jennifer leaned forward. What Charles doesn't understand is that every woman he's destroyed has become stronger. We are all out here building careers, raising children, living lives he said we'd never have without him. And we remember. She showed me the network she'd built. Former girlfriends who were now executives, ex-mistresses who'd become entrepreneurs, women Charles had humiliated who transformed that humiliation into rocket fuel for their own success. Margaret Lynn connected us all, Jennifer explained. Started a support group that became something more. We share information, provide references for each other, warn newcomers about men like Charles and his circle. An underground railroad for corporate wives. More like a quiet revolution. She pulled out her phone, opened an encrypted messaging app. With your permission, I'd like to add you to our group. We call ourselves the Dismissed. The chat history was illuminating. Women sharing job opportunities, offering emotional support, celebrating victories, and throughout, a common thread, they'd all been publicly humiliated by men who thought destroying them would be easy. Charles made one crucial mistake. Jennifer said, he assumes women he's dismissed disappear, but we don't disappear. We transform, and we remember everything. She pulled up financial records on her computer. I've been tracking Meridian Capital for 2 years, building a civil case, but criminal charges, that's the golden ticket. Your evidence could bring down not just Charles, but his entire network. Over the next 2 hours, Jennifer walked me through her files. The patterns were staggering. Not just Charles, but his entire social circle had histories of financial misconduct intertwined with personal cruelty. They shared lawyers, tactics, even scripts for destroying inconvenient women. Look at this, she said, pulling up a recorded conversation from a corporate retreat. Charles's voice, along with James Weatherby and others, discussing divorce strategies like they were stock options. The key is public humiliation, Charles was saying. Break them psychologically before the legal proceedings. They'll take any settlement just to make it stop. I've done it twice now. Works every time. Your birthday dinner was planned months in advance, Jennifer confirmed. They probably placed bets on how you'd react. But among the cruelty, she'd found something else. Financial crimes, the same patterns I discovered. But going back years, elderly clients, small thefts, elaborate schemes. With your evidence and mine combined, she didn't need to finish. The authorities will have to act. More than that, the civil suits alone will destroy them, every client they've stolen from, every employee they've harassed, every woman they've humiliated. We all have standing. Class action suits, individual lawsuits, criminal charges. She smiled. Death by 1,000 paper cuts. All perfectly legal. She gave me a flash drive with everything she'd collected. Add this to what you and Rachel have. When you're ready to file, I want to be there. We all do. As I left her office, Jennifer called after me. Savannah, that red dress was perfect. We all saw the footage. You looked like a queen. He wanted you to look broken. Instead, you looked unbreakable. That evening, I met Rachel at our usual cafe. She reviewed Jennifer's files with professional appreciation. This changes everything, she said. We are not just taking down Charles anymore. We are dismantling an entire network. Is that possible? With this much evidence, this many victims ready to testify, this much documentation. She actually smiled. They built their own prosecution. We just have to deliver it. I thought about Henry, who'd waited 15 years to hand over that footage. Jennifer, who'd spent 2 years building files. The women in the dismissed chat, all working quietly toward justice. Charles thought he'd orchestrated my humiliation. He'd actually orchestrated his own downfall. And he'd invited 17 witnesses to watch it happen. The dossier grew heavier each day, both physically and metaphorically. Rachel and I spent weeks organizing evidence into what she called agency-specific packages, each one tailored to destroy a different aspect of Charles's carefully constructed life. For this transaction patterns showing market manipulation, insider trading networks, and systematic fraud. Rachel had traced shell companies through 3 countries, following money like breadcrumbs back to Charles's personal accounts. For the IRS, unreported income totaling millions, tax shelters that existed only on paper, charitable donations to foundations that Charles controlled. The tax fraud alone could put him away for 20 years, Rachel noted with satisfaction. For the FBI, elder financial abuse cases with meticulous documentation, Mrs. Hartwell's retirement fund gutted, Mr. Patterson's life savings dissolved into offshore accounts. 17 other victims, all over 70, all trusting Charles with their futures. For the State Attorney General, consumer fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, violations of state banking laws. Jennifer Walsh had contributed case law showing precedent for criminal prosecution. But this, Rachel said, pulling out a thick manila envelope. This is the masterpiece. Inside was a document that connected everything, emails between Charles and his network discussing their schemes, recorded conversations about targeting elderly clients, even a shared spreadsheet tracking their thefts. They'd been so arrogant, so certain of their invincibility, that they documented their own crimes. Margaret Lynn provided the final piece, Rachel explained. Her ex-husband kept recordings of their strategy sessions. Listen to this. She played audio from her laptop. Charles's voice, clear and confident, the Patterson account is perfect. Early dementia means he won't track the discrepancies. We can move 300,000 before anyone notices. Split it through the Cayman accounts. Wash it through the consulting firms. James Weatherby responded. What about his family? Son's estranged. Daughter lives in Seattle. By the time anyone checks, we'll have documentation showing he authorized everything. The beauty of confused old people. They can't remember what they didn't sign. They laughed. Actually laughed about stealing from a man with dementia. This recording is from 6 months ago, Rachel said. They've gotten sloppier since then, and greedier. I thought about Mr. Patterson, who'd reminded me of my grandfather. The confusion in his eyes when he'd asked Charles about his missing funds at a client dinner. Charles's smooth assurance that everything was invested wisely, that the market was just volatile, that he should trust his advisor. How do we ensure maximum impact? I asked. Rachel smiled. Simultaneous delivery, same day, same hour. Every agency gets their package at once. No time for them to coordinate damage control. No opportunity to hide assets or destroy evidence. But she wasn't done. From her bag, she pulled out one final envelope. This one marked press. The Wall Street Journal has been investigating Meridian Capital for 2 years, she explained. Reporter named David Kumar. Jennifer put me in touch with him. He's been waiting for an inside source. You want me to go to the media? Not you. The evidence. Let the documents speak. Kumar's editor has already agreed if the evidence is solid, they'll run it front page. The public humiliation Charles loves so much, he's about to experience it on a national scale. We spent the next week finalizing everything. Each package included executive summaries highlighting the most damaging evidence, financial documents with expert annotations explaining the crimes, audio recordings with transcripts, victim testimonials, including heartbreaking letters from elderly clients, a timeline showing how the network operated over 7 years. Margaret Lynn contributed surveillance footage from her divorce proceedings, showing Charles and others counting cash in what they thought was a secure location. Jennifer Walsh added employment records, showing a pattern of hiring and discarding female employees after inappropriate relationships. The women of the dismissed provided corroborating evidence of harassment, fraud, and systematic abuse. It's like a criminal RICO case, Rachel marveled. They built an actual criminal enterprise, complete with hierarchy and profit sharing. The night before delivery, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my grandmother's chair, holding her pearls, thinking about justice, not revenge justice. For Mrs. Hartwell, living on Social Security. For Mr. Patterson, confused and betrayed. For Jennifer, who'd rebuilt her life from ashes. For all the dismissed women who'd been told they were worthless. Rachel had arranged for a courier service to deliver everything simultaneously. 9 packages to 9 different offices at exactly 9 a.m. on a Wednesday. Charles would be in his weekly partners' meeting surrounded by his co-conspirators when the world began to end. Are you ready for this? Rachel asked during our final meeting. I thought about my students, how I taught them about consequences and fairness, how I showed them that bullies don't win in the end, that truth matters, that standing up for others is the highest form of courage. I've been ready since he left me with that check, I said. The packages were perfect, professional binding, color-coded tabs, each document precisely where it needed to be. The FBI package alone contained enough evidence to launch a dozen investigations. The IRS file would trigger audits going back a decade. The SEC submission would freeze assets within hours. And the media package, that was pure poetry. David Kumar had promised to have a team ready. Photographers positioned outside Meridian Capital's offices. The story would break online while Charles was still in his meeting, would be trending before he could call his lawyer. "One more thing," Rachel said, pulling out a final document. "Your divorce filing." Jennifer prepared it pro bono. It includes emergency motions to freeze assets, citing the criminal investigations. Charles won't be able to move a penny once this hits. I signed where indicated, noting the grounds: adultery, financial fraud, and moral turpitude, that beautiful, archaic phrase that Charles had ignored in our prenup. "What about Victoria?" I asked, thinking of the woman in his emails, the Cartier bracelet meant for another woman's wrist. "Oh, didn't I mention?" Rachel's smile was wicked. "She's been cooperating with the FBI for 3 months. Turns out she discovered the fraud independently and got scared. She's been wearing a wire to their dates." I actually laughed. Charles, who prided himself on reading people, on manipulating everyone around him, had been pillow talking with a federal informant. That night, I cleared out my classroom, packing up personal items, not because I was leaving teaching, never that, but because I knew the media storm would be intense. My students didn't deserve to be caught in the splash zone of Charles's destruction. I left lesson plans for the substitute, notes about each child's needs. Michaela was struggling with fractions. James needed encouragement with his writing. Aisha required extra hugs on Mondays after difficult weekends with her divorced parents. These children, whom Charles dismissed as beneath notice, who lived in neighborhoods he'd never visit, whose parents worked jobs he mocked, they mattered. They were the point. They were why stealing from elderly clients to fund yacht purchases was obscene. They were why men like Charles needed to face consequences. On my desk, I left my grandmother's pearl necklace in its velvet box with a note, "For strength in difficult times." The substitute teacher, whoever she was, would need armor for the soul. The pearls had done their job for me. As I walked out of PS 158, I thought about transformation. Charles had been right. I wasn't the same woman he'd married 7 years ago. That woman would have cried at the restaurant, would have begged for understanding, would have accepted whatever crumbs he offered. This woman had built a case that would destroy an empire. The packages would be delivered in 12 hours. By tomorrow afternoon, federal agents would be raiding offices. Assets would be frozen. Handcuffs would be applied to manicured wrists. The Wall Street Journal's front page would feature photos of Charles being led away. His Armani suit, no armor against justice, and somewhere, Mrs. Hartwell would get a call that her money might be recovered. Mr. Patterson's children would learn their father had been victimized, not careless. The dismissed women would see their humiliation transformed into vindication. I touched the empty space where my pearls usually rested. Time for the reckoning to begin. Wednesday morning arrived crisp and clear. I sat in my sister's kitchen in Brooklyn, watching the clock tick toward 9 a.m. Sarah had taken the day off, sensing the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Her coffee maker gurgled while we waited in companionable silence. "You sure about this?" she asked for the 100th time. "I've never been more sure of anything." At 8:47, my phone buzzed. "Rachel, packages confirmed delivered to all agencies. Kumar's team is in position." At 8:53, Jennifer Walsh texted, "Second enforcement is mobilizing. My sources say they've been waiting for this." At 8:58, Margaret Lynn messaged the dismissed group. Local news vans just pulled up outside Meridian Capital. At 9 o'clock exactly, I opened my laptop to the Wall Street Journal homepage. The headline hit like thunder, breaking, "Federal agents raid Meridian Capital in massive elder fraud investigation." Below it, Charles's professional headshot stared back at me, the same photo he'd insisted on updating every year, showing him in his best light. Now it would be the image associated with his downfall. Kumar's article was devastating in its thoroughness. He'd woven together the evidence beautifully, creating a narrative that was both damning and impossible to refute. The elderly victims were humanized with photos and quotes. The financial crimes were explained in terms anyone could understand. And there, in paragraph 3, was the line that made me smile. The investigation was prompted by extensive documentation provided by an anonymous whistleblower with intimate knowledge of Meridian's operations. By 9:15, the scene outside Meridian Capital was chaos. Sarah and I watched on her tablet as federal agents carried boxes out of the building. Charles's Maserati was being loaded onto a flatbed truck. Employees stood on the sidewalk, some crying, others on their phones with what I assumed were lawyers. Then I saw him. Charles being led out in handcuffs. His Armani suit was rumpled. His perfect hair mussed. The confidence that had filled LeBernardin just days ago was gone, replaced by something I'd never seen on his face, fear. Real, bone-deep fear. Behind him came James Weatherby, then Richard Martinelli, then 6 other members of their circle, the network that had seemed so powerful, so untouchable, reduced to a perp walk on national television. My phone exploded with notifications. The dismissed chat was electric with celebration. Former victims sharing their joy, journalists requesting comments, even my students' parents, who had no idea of my connection, forwarding the article with notes like, "Can you believe this?" At 10:30, Charles called from federal detention. I let it go to voicemail. "Savannah, what did you do? What did you do? This is insane. You don't understand. These people will destroy you. Call my lawyer. Get me out. You're still my wife. You have to." The message cut off. Federal detention limited call length. Apparently, by noon, the story had evolved. The FBI had released a statement confirming dozens of victims, millions in stolen funds, charges ranging from wire fraud to money laundering. The IRS announced unprecedented asset freezes. The state attorney general promised swift and severe justice for those who prey on vulnerable seniors. But the best moment came at 2 p.m. when Kumar published his follow-up piece, "The Women They Dismissed: How a Network of Survivors Brought Down Wall Street's Predator Elite." He'd interviewed Jennifer, Margaret, and 3 other women from our group. Their stories, told with dignity and strength, painted a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond financial crimes, the country club humiliations, the public degradations, the careful psychological torture. All of it laid bare. And throughout the article, a common thread, these men had created their own downfall by underestimating the women they dismissed. They thought we'd disappear. Jennifer was quoted as saying, "Instead, we took notes." Charles called again, at 4 p.m. This time, I answered. "How could you?" His voice was hoarse, desperate. 7 years, Savannah. 7 years I gave you everything. No, Charles. 7 years you took everything. My dignity, my friends, my self-worth. You made me small so you could feel big. The prenup's moral turpitude clause. Your lawyer should have read it more carefully. You vindictive. I'm a teacher, Charles. I taught my students about consequences. Consider this your final lesson. I hung up before he could respond. By evening, the full scope was becoming clear. 37 elderly victims identified, over $50 million stolen, a network of 15 men across 4 firms implicated. The investigation was expanding internationally, following offshore accounts through Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. Mrs. Hartwell was interviewed on the evening news, dignified in her grief. I trusted him, she said simply. He seemed like such a nice young man. Mr. Patterson's daughter flew in from Seattle. Tears streaming as she thanked the brave whistleblower who'd exposed the truth. My father worked his whole life for that money. To know someone stole it while he was vulnerable, it's unconscionable. The dismissed chat shared screenshots of the men's social media accounts being deleted, their country club memberships revoked, their charity board positions rescinded. The same institutions that had embraced them were now distancing themselves at light speed. It's not justice, Margaret Lynn observed. It's erasure. They are being removed from the world they thought they owned. That night, Sarah ordered Chinese food, and we sat on her couch watching news coverage on mute. The same footage played repeatedly, Charles in handcuffs, boxes of evidence being loaded into FBI vans, victims telling their stories. How do you feel? Sarah asked. I thought about it. Relief, satisfaction, vindication, all of those, but something more. Free. I said finally. I feel free. My phone rang, an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Mrs. Aldridge, this is Principal Morrison from PS 158. I'm sorry to bother you during your personal leave, but I wanted you to know an anonymous donation just came through. $5 million for new computers, books, and after-school programs. The donor specified it should be allocated to your classroom first. I knew immediately Rachel had mentioned that frozen assets could be redirected to victims through civil forfeiture. Someone, probably Jennifer, had made sure Charles's stolen money would end up helping the children he dismissed as beneath notice. That's wonderful news, I managed through tears. There's a note, Principal Morrison continued. It says, for Mrs. A's students. May they learn that justice is worth teaching and worth fighting for. Do you know what that means? I smiled, thinking of Michaela and James and Aisha. Of all the children who would benefit from resources bought with money that had been stolen from grandparents just like theirs. Yes, I said. I know exactly what it means. As I hung up, Sarah squeezed my hand. On the television, they were showing Charles's mugshot. He looked older, smaller, ordinary, the emperor without his clothes, the wizard without his curtain. I thought about my grandmother's pearls, sitting in my empty classroom, about the strength they'd given me, the armor they'd provided. Tomorrow I'd go back and retrieve them. Next week, I'd return to teaching. The media storm would pass. The attention would fade, but the lessons would remain. Charles had been right about one thing at that birthday dinner. I had been a disgrace to myself, for allowing him to diminish me for so long. But disgrace, I'd learned, was just another word for transformation waiting to happen. And transformation, like justice, was worth teaching. My phone buzzed one last time. A text from an unknown number. This is Victoria Chen. Thank you. He destroyed me, too. Your courage gave me mine. I deleted the message and blocked the number. Some chapters, once closed, didn't need epilogues. Outside Sarah's window, Manhattan glittered like a promise. Somewhere in federal detention, Charles was learning what powerlessness felt like. Somewhere in Connecticut, Mrs. Hartwell was learning her money might be recovered. Somewhere in my classroom, my grandmother's pearls waited to armor another soul. The wheel of justice had turned. The world had shifted just a little toward fairness, and I had papers to grade by Monday. The settlement conference took place 6 months later in a glass tower that pierced the Manhattan sky. I arrived in a simple black dress and my grandmother's pearls, no costume jewelry. No borrowed designer clothes, just me. Armed with truth and the best legal team a successful class action lawsuit could provide. Charles sat across the mahogany table, a shadow of his former self. Federal prison had taken its toll. His perfect hair was gray at the roots. His marathon runner physique softened. The orange jumpsuit he'd worn to court had been replaced by a cheap suit, but nothing could restore the power he'd once wielded like a weapon. His lawyer, surprisingly, wasn't the shark he'd always threatened me with, but a public defender. All his assets frozen, his network dismantled. His high-powered attorneys had abandoned him like rats from a sinking yacht. My client is prepared to agree to all terms, the defender said wearily. She looked young, overwhelmed, probably wondering how she'd drawn the short straw of representing one of Wall Street's most hated men. Jennifer Walsh, magnificent in her role as my attorney, slid the papers across the table. Let's review the terms one final time. Mrs. Aldridge receives the Manhattan apartment free and clear. Alimony set at 60% of any future earnings Mr. Aldridge might accumulate after his release. All traceable legitimate assets split equally, with Mrs. Aldridge's share paid from recovered funds. Future earnings, Charles laughed bitterly. What future? I'll be lucky to get a job at McDonald's when I get out. That's not my client's concern, Jennifer continued smoothly. Additionally, Mr. Aldridge forfeits all claims to shared property, waives any right to appeal, and acknowledges the prenuptial agreement's moral turpitude clause has been activated by his criminal conviction. Page after page of consequences, each signature another nail in the coffin of the life Charles had built on others' backs. His hand shook as he signed, whether from rage or defeat, I couldn't tell. There's one more matter, Jennifer added, producing a final document. A personal statement acknowledging the harm caused to Mrs. Aldridge and taking full responsibility for the dissolution of the marriage. This wasn't in the original agreement, his lawyer protested. No, Jennifer agreed. But Mr. Aldridge might want to consider that the criminal trial is ongoing. My client's testimony could be influential regarding sentencing. Cooperation here might be viewed favorably. Charles's eyes met mine for the first time since I'd entered the room. I saw him searching for the woman he'd married, the compliant teacher who'd smiled through humiliation, who'd stood silent while he erased her piece by piece. That woman was gone. In her place sat someone he'd never bothered to know, a survivor who'd orchestrated his downfall with the same precision he'd once used to steal millions. Fine, he spat, grabbing the pen. What do you want me to write? The truth, I said, speaking for the first time. Just once, Charles. Write the truth. His hand moved across the page in sharp, angry strokes. I, Charles Theodore Aldridge, acknowledge that I systematically emotionally abused my wife, Savannah Aldridge. Throughout our marriage, I used my position and resources to diminish, humiliate, and control her. I take full responsibility for the destruction of our marriage and the pain I caused. She deserved better. I studied the man I'd once loved, searching for any trace of the idealistic young analyst who'd written poetry on diner napkins. That person had been a fiction, perhaps. Or maybe just another casualty of his ambition. No, Charles, I'm not happy, I said. Mrs. Hartwell isn't happy. She still cries about the retirement you stole. Mr. Patterson died thinking he'd lost his own money through carelessness. Happiness isn't what this is about. Then what? His voice cracked. Revenge. Justice, I corrected. And making sure you never do this to anyone else. The papers were collected, notarized, filed. As we stood to leave, Charles made one last attempt. Savannah, wait. You won. You destroyed me. Isn't that enough? Can't you find any forgiveness? We had good times once. Remember Bar Harbor? Remember that night under the stars when I proposed? That was real. I paused at the door. Considering his words, Jennifer touched my arm in warning. But I needed to say this. You know what was real, Charles? My students' handmade birthday cards. Maria's bodega cupcake. Henry the maitre d' waiting 15 years to give me that footage. The network of women you dismissed who spent years documenting your crimes. That's what's real. That's what lasts. I turned to face him fully. You built a tower on the backs of the women you destroyed, I just made sure it crumbled. His face contorted. You ruined my life. No, I said quietly. You ruined your life. I just kept excellent records. Outside the conference room, Jennifer hugged me. That was perfect. How do you feel? Like a teacher who just gave the most important lesson of her career. We walked out into the New York afternoon together. The city hummed with its usual energy, taxis honking, people rushing, life moving forward. My phone buzzed with messages from the dismissed, celebrating this final victory. 3 blocks away, I stopped at a flower shop and bought a single white rose. At the courthouse, where Charles would stand trial next month, I left it on the steps with a note for all the victims who didn't live to see justice. That evening, I returned to my apartment now. Stripped of Charles's pretentious artwork and cold furniture, I donated it all, filling the space instead with bright colors, children's artwork from my students, photos of family and friends Charles had tried to exile from my life. On the mantel, where Charles's deal tombstones once stood like monuments to greed, I placed a simple photo, my grandmother in her Sunday best, pearls gleaming, chin raised in quiet defiance against whatever the world threw at her. My phone rang. Principal Morrison, excited about the summer program the donation would fund. We talked about curriculum, about giving these children experiences Charles would have deemed worthless, art classes, music lessons, theater workshops, everything that made life rich beyond money's measure. After we hung up, I made tea in my grandmother's china and sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle. Tomorrow I'd return to my classroom, to children who needed me, to work that mattered. The media circus had died down. The reporters had moved on to other scandals. I was just Mrs. A again, the teacher who made math fun and kept graham crackers in her drawer. But some of my students had seen the news, understood in their 8-year-old way that something big had happened. Aisha had made me a card with a stick figure in a superhero cape. Mrs. A saved the grandmas and grandpas. She wasn't wrong. My laptop dinged with an email from Rachel Preston. The FBI had expanded the investigation internationally. 57 firms were now under scrutiny. New regulations were being drafted. Charles's case had become a textbook study in financial crime and elder abuse. You changed the industry, Rachel wrote. They'll call it the Aldridge effect when victims of financial crime fight back and win. I closed the laptop. Charles had been wrong about many things, but especially this. I hadn't been a placeholder. I'd been a teacher all along, gathering evidence like homework, building a case like a lesson plan, educating the world about what happens when evil goes unchecked. In prison, Charles would have years to think about the night he left me with that bill. The moment he chose cruelty over kindness, degradation over respect, he'd thought he was ending my story. Instead, he'd written the beginning of his own ending. I touched my pearls one last time before bed, thinking of my grandmother's words, never let them see you without your armor, Savannah. I hadn't just worn my armor. I'd turned it into a sword. And somewhere in the city, 17 women who'd been dismissed, discarded, and disrespected were living their best lives, free from the men who'd tried to break them. We'd all learned the same lesson: dignity isn't something anyone can take from you. You can only give it away. And taking it back, that's not revenge. That's redemption. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss your thoughts about Savannah's journey. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to help more people discover this tale of justice and redemption. Your support means everything, and it helps these important stories reach those who need to hear them most.